We are going to be talking about risk, and we're going to be talking about different elements of risk and how it pertains to the questions we care about in money and banking. In finance, when we talk about risk, we are thinking of some measure of uncertainty about receiving a future payoff and what its real value might be after making an investment. And here investment in the financial world can mean buying a financial instrument like a bond, and we are looking over a well-defined time horizon. It's relatively easy to measure risk when we have a definite knowledge of the relevant probabilities. So, for example, you see there a classic normal distribution. So we know the mean, we also know the variance, and the standard deviation is the square root of the variance. So we have complete confidence in our ability to accurately assess risk. Another example would be flipping a fair coin or a card game. We can calculate the probability of a given event, and that allows us to measure risk very accurately. Here are some of the common terms. Variance and standard deviation come straight from probability theory. Value at risk is the estimate of what would be lost if an institution closed its doors. Leverage is the ratio of the cost of making an investment relative to the owner's own contribution. The owner's contribution and the cost of investment can be different when it's possible to borrow money to make some kind of financial bet. So if I contribute $10 but I borrow $90, then the ratio of my total bet to what I personally contributed is 100 to 10, 10 to 1. What I've done is I've leveraged or magnified the size of my bet by borrowing. Risk aversion is the natural and normal assumption that agents prefer less risk to more risk for a given identical expected return. Risk premium is the reward that a lender would require in order to take on risk. Systematic risk is the sort of risk that applies to everybody or every agent in the affected market. So if the economy falls into a downturn, everybody in the relevant market will be affected by that downturn. One example is if your country or state sells oil, every country and every state that sells oil will be hurt if the world oil price falls. That's a systematic risk. Idiosyncratic risk is risk that is unique to one entity. So if I have a particular special product I sell and the market for that particular product falls, only my organization suffers. other organizations selling similar but different products are not affected. So if you're a financial institution or if you're a financial investor, risk comes from two directions. One direction is the sort of general risk that will affect everybody in the same market, and there is idiosyncratic risk, a risk peculiar to my particular institution because of the business that it's in or the product that it sells or special sort of cost situation that my organization has and my competitors do not. Now let's talk about a peculiar kind of risk that is different from the previous two. Systemic risk. Systemic risk is not the same as systematic risk. It is not the same thing. Got that? I'm making this point because it's very easy for somebody to confuse systemic risk and systematic risk. So what is this systemic risk, which is a different thing? Systemic risk is a fundamental riskiness or fragility arising from a system's design. Or if you prefer, it's a set of vulnerabilities in a financial institution network that makes the system fragile, even if individual institutions considered in isolation are safe. I think it'll be clear in the next slide. See this in the top picture. You have a bunch of dominoes, but they are spaced out in such a way that if one of them falls, it will just fall in between the other dominoes. So there is no systemic risk. If the domino next to me falls, too bad for that domino, but it does not affect me. Think of the dominoes as banks. A banking system with no systemic risk is a banking system where if one bank fails, it will not affect the other banks. Look at the diagram below. Now we do have systemic risk. The dominoes are connected in such a way that if one falls, it will bring down a lot more dominoes with it. So think of the dominoes in the bottom diagram as banks that are connected in a network in a way that if one falls, it could bring down other banks, even when the other banks are fundamentally sound, fundamentally safe. Systemic risk is important because of the 2007 financial crash. Systemic risk helps to explain why the financial crash in 2007 was so damaging, but it also helps explain why the financial crash was such a surprise. Before the crash, if regulators went from one bank to another financial institution, checking to see if it was sound, if it was safe, mostly institutions considered in isolation looked good. The vulnerability, though, was that the system itself had this systemic risk. It was like the dominoes that were all connected in such a way that if just one or two important dominoes fell, they could bring down all the other dominoes. Now, systemic risk is not the kind of risk that is normally taught in a financial class, And the reason is financial courses focus on the individual institution and how to manage its affairs efficiently. The big picture, the big picture, thinking about the health of an entire financial system belongs in the realm of economics. So that's why in a money and banking course, we are going to talk about systemic risk. And it's very important to think about that. Okay? Systemic risk is a function of the structure of the banking or financial system itself, which means that the traditional solutions of diversification and hedging at the individual institution level don't necessarily help. The usual solutions are not sufficient to eliminate systemic risk. See you next time.